Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the UN-hosted Consultations for Action on the COVID-19 Social and Economic Response. My name is Magdi Martinez-Soliman. I represent UNDP in the Eastern Caribbean, and I will be your facilitator today of a prestigious panel, which I will introduce after a few remarks. It is no secret that we are facing a general recession in the Caribbean. As I was preparing for my introductory remarks, I received a WhatsApp featuring a news from Foreign Affairs that states a tsunami of debt distress is coming our way. Declines in many, if not most, countries, in most industries, sectors, and islands are resulting from an output contraction, raising unemployment, and a future of industries becoming unprofitable, eventually bankrupt, laying off workforce, and spiraling into a lower wages pay structure. This massive disruption is likely to be followed by high unemployment for months, if not for years. Governments are guiding the transition with the support of their development partners, with appropriate social relief, fiscal and industrial policy measures. But the slumps in travel, tourism, mass entertainment, public events, sit-down eateries, hotels, hospitality, catering, classrooms, of course, personal services, and other such activities have been due to the physical distancing and other containment requirements. There was no real choice as lives were at stake. The impact has, however, been economically devastating, especially on female employment, as women used to occupy the numerous positions in the lower echelons of the care industry and the low-wage workforce in the tourism sector, also in the region. Governments, in turn, have been struggling to implement support, relief, and stimulus measures that can be financially sustained over time, as most activities that feed the social protection entitlement will probably not fully resume anytime soon. At the same time, no one, and I believe the panel will agree with me on this, can afford an across-the-board impoverishment of Caribbean societies. Thus, the need to cast the social protection net as wide as necessary and build a social protection floor as solid as financially possible. Because one size does not fit all, we have today a panel of leaders on a broad spectrum who all of them, in their respective responsibilities, have designed, supported, funded, and led different social protection responses to the crisis. Our keynote speaker is the Honorable Andrew Fahy, the Premier of the BVI. His Excellency, Mr. Andrew Arturo Fahy, is also the territory's Minister of Finance. He is the current chairman of the Virgin Islands party in the BVI. He was elected member for the 1st District, a position which he has held since the 1999 general election. He has served in the past as Minister of Education and as Minister of Health in his country. Over the past years, Premier Fahy has led the territory on a path of recovery, stability, and diversification of its blue economy, and is now leading the stabilization package to maintain the local economy as sheltered as possible from the impact. I am quite sure that he will eloquently speak about this economic protection program and his views on access to international finance for government like his to implement strong social protection programs. Mr. Premier, you have the floor. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Well, I'd like to thank you very much for having me. And I want to say that it's indeed a pleasure to be here. And I just want to say that His Excellency, Ms. Marie Legault, High Commissioner of Canada to Barbados, Honorable Camilo Gonzalez, my good friend that I haven't seen for a little while, Minister of Finance, Economic Planning, Sustainable Development and Technology, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Mr. Magdi Martinez-Soliman, the UNDP representative for Barbados and the OECS, I'm sorry, and Mr. Sheen Said, World Bank Country Director for Latin America and the Caribbean, and Dr. Alois Camarue, I hope I pronounced it correctly, UNICEF representative for the Eastern Caribbean. And ladies and gentlemen, a pleasant good day and God's blessings to everyone. So, Mr. Chairman, I would like to begin by thanking you for the very generous invitation to make remarks on the importance of social protection in the COVID-19 response of the Eastern Caribbean. This sub-region has never been more vulnerable than it is right now. We are in the midst of a global pandemic that is severely impacting our tourism-dependent economies, while at the same time in a new hurricane season in which several islands, including the Virgin Islands, are still recovering from Hurricanes Irma and Maria in 2017. We call them Maria. These circumstances have increased the economic and social pressures within our societies that are increasing the vulnerability of at-risk groups, such as the elderly, sick, poor, homeless, women, and children. I believe the Virgin Islands' experience in managing the crisis thus far can provide some insight on the challenges involved in protecting the most vulnerable persons in society, while responding to the negative impact of COVID-19 that is as much an economic crisis as it is a health crisis. Please permit me, however, to first commend the United Nations on its COVID-19 multi-sectoral response strategy, under which the BVI and other governments in the Eastern Caribbean have already begun receiving support. The strategy's implementation will complement the COVID-19 responses already underway in the sub-region. The international institutions and countries that have made pledges to support the strategy have our gratitude for their commitment to small island developing states in this part of the world. I also want to acknowledge the recent launch of the Sustainable Development Goals Fund Joint Program on Social Protection for Barbados, St. Lucia, and the OECS, which I am confident will be a success. I look forward to the BVI receiving support at the appropriate juncture in the program's rollout. In terms of BVI COVID-19 response, ladies and gentlemen, following the World Health Organization's designation of the novel coronavirus as a global pandemic, the BVI took decisive action to contain its spread among our population. We suspended cruise ships, closed the borders, and went into lockdown. These preventative measures were necessary to prevent the unnecessary loss of life and to ensure the health and safety of our people. They were the right decisions, tough decisions, but they were the right decisions. The projections were that if we did not do the preventative measures and scientific data that could bear me out, that we would have had over 3,700 persons in the British Virgin Islands infected with COVID-19. I'm pleased to share with you that after 8 reported infections, including one very sad death, there are currently no active confirmed cases of COVID-19 reported in the British Virgin Islands. Through mandatory social distancing and hygiene requirements, we are working diligently to prevent any additional infections. As a territory, we understand that we are not out of the woods, as persons could be asymptomatic, and we are fighting an invisible enemy just like the rest of the world. So we continue to engage in aggressive contact tracing. Our good progress has permitted us to restart the economy and maintain the functioning of our internal market for goods and services. At each stage of our health, social, and economic response to COVID-19, social protection has been integrated into our decision-making. That leads me into the health response and social protection. In the health response, we have placed a high priority on senior citizens as the group most vulnerable to the health risks attached to COVID-19. to help minimize their risk of infection. Early on in the response, sanitization packages were safely delivered to their homes. Senior citizens were also given first priority by supermarkets and pharmacies in preparations for 24-hour curfew and also during replenishment periods. Additionally, as I speak, on June 2nd, our territory successfully crossed another milestone in the journey of living and working with COVID-19 under the new regular. We began the phased and controlled reopening of our borders, particularly at the Terence B. Lettsome International Airport. Under this phase, only nationals, belongers, holders of permanent residence, and naturalized citizens of the Virgin Islands are being allowed entry into the territory. These persons would have been unable to return to the territory because the borders were closed. We had our first 2 flights come in yesterday. It is important that I emphasize here that our returning nationals and residents must adhere to the health and safety requirements that are in place. This includes mandatory testing for COVID-19 and following the mandatory quarantine procedures. Whether persons are staying in private quarantine spaces pre-approved by the Ministry of Health or government quarantine spaces, we have asked our people to ensure a sense of responsibility and that they all comply with the mandatory procedures so that we are not forced to consider other stringent measures. A measure such as security has been implemented to ensure that persons adhere to the mandatory procedures. We want to keep everyone safe and ensure the social protection of all. And we always say that we thank God for what He has enabled us to do thus far in this fight against COVID-19. But that brings me to our social response and social protection. The social response to COVID-19 has been aimed at ensuring that the basic needs of the vulnerable are met and that they are protected. As a head of government and leader of government business, I made a pledge during the lockdown that no one in the Virgin Islands will go hungry under my watch during this crisis. Persons considered vulnerable were provided with vouchers in advance to stock up on food, supplies of food before the lockdown, and were given care packages. Throughout the lockdown period of 18 days, a food provisioning program for the homeless and vulnerable was in place to ensure they received daily meals. This program was scaled up to include any household in need on the populated islands after the lockdown was extended by an additional week to prevent community spread. I would like to highlight here that the government, in our communications with the public during the lockdown, appealed to the community at large not to engage in domestic violence. This was supported by a stepped up police response to reports of abuse, which continues today. In terms of the impact on children, school campuses have remained closed since the lockdown and learning is taking place online. To support this, we are providing laptops to students in those households that do not have a computer or a laptop available for educational use. The major challenge we are currently facing is where parents have gone back to work and students are unsupervised at home. We are working on creative solutions. However, for students deemed at risk of domestic violence, we are allowing them to come to their school campus to receive instruction. We are also considering a meal program for those students who otherwise will not have the required number of daily meals to be healthy. That leads me into our economic response to COVID-19. In our economic response to COVID-19, social protection is addressed in multiple ways. This includes the introduction of a short-term unemployment benefit scheme of $10 million to provide income support to persons for 3 months. Additional funds of $3.9 million have also been allocated to an assistance grant program to help those persons who may not qualify for the unemployment scheme. These measures are critical to provide some financial safety net for the many who have been laid off, particularly in the tourism sector. Separately, funds have been earmarked to assist families in reinforcing their homes for the current hurricane season. This is especially targeted at persons who are unable to complete repairs to their homes after Hurricanes Irma and Maria in 2017. Social housing is also being constructed to provide homes to the most vulnerable persons who do not have the prospect of securing a home on their own. The obvious challenge that the government of the Virgin Islands faces, as well as many other governments in the Eastern Caribbean, is how to financially sustain our COVID-19 response until the global pandemic recedes and the world economy begins to recover. Presently, revenue is down with government support is needed most. Borrowing alone cannot be the answer, given the limited borrowing headroom of many governments. This constraint suggests that special external support will be required from the international community. I'm aware that this has already begun for some of our neighbors. What would also be helpful are as many grants, technical assistance, and concessional loans as can be offered to support the COVID-19 response of governments in the Eastern Caribbean. That's why we have to look about strengthening social protection. Ladies and gentlemen, while the Virgin Islands has made every effort to include social protection in our COVID-19 response, this crisis has exposed areas of our social protection system that need to be strengthened. Socially, we need a more robust national system for identifying, tracking, and supporting the poor. Toward this end, we are receiving the generous support of the World Food Programme and the development of a social registry that will help us target support to the most vulnerable in our population when there's a natural disaster or some other shock. In terms of unemployment, the Virgin Islands requires an unemployment scheme solution to provide displaced employees with some measure of financial security in the event of layoffs. However, such a solution should be affordable and appropriate for our context as a small open economy with a transient labor force. I'm very keen to hear perspectives on this complex issue. I'm also keen to hear our input on how we must continue to handle catastrophic events given our geographic locations here in the Caribbean. So ladies and gentlemen, I hope that my remarks have given you a sense of the challenges we face on the social protection front and sufficiently staged for the other distinguished panelists. More support is needed in this critical area as the COVID-19 crisis continues. Mr. Chairman, as I close, I want to express my gratitude to the UNDP Office for Barbados and the OECS for your support to the BVI. The advice and technical assistance you have provided to my government and generous grants to support micro, small, and medium enterprises have been invaluable. To all international partners involved in the COVID-19 response in the Eastern Caribbean, I say thank you and wish you a safe hurricane season as we are all in this together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, very much, Premier Foy. This sets the tone really for our discussion. I have taken copious notes of a number of very salient remarks that you have uttered. Indeed, the challenge we face has exposed the weaker areas that we all have, and indeed, one of the major challenges is how to finance the response. I believe several of our panelists will address these two issues in their own remarks, but let me thank you here very much for your keynote speech today that indeed starts us off on a very good foot. So let me now move to Minister Camilo Gonçalves. Mr. Gonçalves is the Minister of Finance, Economic Planning, Sustainable Development and Technology of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, a former permanent representative of St. Vincent and the Grenadines to the UN in New York, and a former foreign minister of his country. Mr. Gonçalves writes on issues of the small islands' unique politics and economic development. His last volume, Globalized, Climatized, Stigmatized, if you haven't read it, is a must for anyone who wants to understand the politics, the economy, and the ecology of small island states. And I'm sure that we will get a glimpse of that in his own remarks today. Honorable Camilo Gonçalves, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Magdi. And as always, your check is in the mail for the endorsement of the book, the royalty check. I'd like to thank you for the invitation to be on the panel and send greetings to my fellow panelists. I would like to thank His Excellency, the Premier of the British Virgin Islands, not only for his statement this morning, but for his leadership within the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, and for the perspective that he's brought as we've all tried to get through this crisis together. I recognize also especially Director Said from the World Bank, who has been very closely associated with all of the countries of the Eastern Caribbean states as we work our way through this crisis, this challenge together. The UNDP has done a lot of work in the area of social protection, and principally and importantly in shifting the conversation from the somewhat antiquated concept of social safety nets. And if you think of a net has more holes in it than it has string or twine. And so there are a lot of places for people to fall through the nets, fall through the cracks. And for leading us to a conversation about social protection floors, and for thinking about social protection, not as a response to this or that economic shock, but as an integral factor in reducing poverty and inequality in our states. And I think it's useful to mention that at the outset, because the crisis invites a conversation about economic protection of vulnerable sectors, more so than a broadly defined concept of social protection, which should exist even if we were not in the midst of the challenges that we're in now. That said, we do have to discuss some stopgap social protection measures, given the very severe challenges that we're facing in the region from the COVID pandemic. The Honorable Premier mentioned the shutdown that many countries in the region experienced, and of course, the external shutdown that led to the collapse of the tourism sector, on which so many of our countries depend. And the fallout has been tremendous. In the case of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank is projecting a double-digit contraction of our economy this year. Our own data indicates that unemployment is already up, unemployment, which is already high, is approaching a double-digit increase in percentage terms as well. And revenues are collapsing at precisely the moment when revenues are needed to assist vulnerable populations in St. Vincent and the Grenadines and in the region. We've heard stories in Antigua and Barbuda, for example, of over 20,000 people being unemployed, given their exposure to the hospitality sector. In Barbados, I understand that there have been about 43,000 applications for unemployment insurance since the crisis has begun. And in a country, the population of, in the case of Barbados, fewer than 300,000 people, you get a sense as to the scope of the challenge that we're facing. In St. Vincent and the Grenadines, we viewed the pandemic through three lenses. First of all, we had to try to minimize the health impact, to save lives, to reduce contagion, and to protect those who are vulnerable from a health perspective. I think that to date, many of the countries of the Caribbean region have done as well as can be expected, and certainly better than some other regions, in containing the healthcare fallout in terms of lives and contagion and community spread and the like. Then there was the imperative to minimize the economic and social impact of the crisis, and then going forward to engage in some sort of targeted stimulus activity so that the countries of the region, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines in this case, would be ready to emerge as quickly as possible from the post-pandemic environment. The minimizing of the economic and social impacts of the crisis has been quite a challenge. In St. Vincent and the Grenadines, we've had, as part of our recovery and stimulus program, we've placed a number of new initiatives on the table to assist in minimizing the impact of the pandemic on various vulnerable sectors of society. Our country and most of the countries in the sub-region do not have a system of unemployment insurance. But as the Premier indicated, a number of us have initiated temporary unemployment insurance programs. St. Vincent and the Grenadines has done a two-tiered program, one for those who are unemployed generally as a result of a slowdown in economic activity generally, and those who are specifically displaced in the hospitality sector, because that was the most immediately affected sector. And the qualifications and the means of accessing those funds differ slightly in those regards. We also knew that the informal sector would be severely impacted, and there is definitely a linkage in economic terms between informality and insecurity and inequality. And we've had to try our best to fashion programs to capture the informal sectors, which are large in all of our countries. And so we have a vendor support program, but it captures more than vendors. But those who earn a living in the informal sector, we've provided resources for those individuals as well. We've increased social assistance payments to people who are vulnerable and people who have been made newly vulnerable by the pandemic. What we noted very early is that there are a number of people who rely on remittances in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. I believe that's the case in many of the countries of the region. But because of the impact of the pandemic in the source countries, they were no longer able to receive the remittances as expected, and they were placed in greater vulnerability, exposure to poverty. St. Vincent and the Grenadines, for example, the second largest employer outside of the government is the cruise ship sector. And the cruise ship, when the cruise ship shut down, the remittances from those crewmen and crewwomen back home to their parents and their children, they also began to dry up. So we had to expand social assistance payments to those who are newly vulnerable as a result of the pandemic. There were a number of ancillary personnel, taxi drivers, tour bus operators who rely on the tourism sector, minibus operators who rely on a functioning town, an open and active town, or rely on transporting school children to and from school. They were all affected, and we had to assist those individuals in various ways. Additionally, St. Vincent and the Grenadines is more than many of the countries in the region, still quite dependent on agriculture produced locally and the export of agricultural products. And the farmers began to lose some of their export markets. Additionally, They lost local markets where they would sell their produce to hotels. And what the government decided to do in that instance essentially was to purchase some of that excess capacity from the agricultural sector and distribute those crops and produce to the more vulnerable members of society. So it was sort of a transfer in that instance. We've expanded what we call our Zero Hunger Trust Fund, the activity which is in line with the Sustainable Development Goals of reducing hunger. We've expanded the activities of that fund, and we've tried to conceptualize new ways to reduce vulnerability other than through traditional means. Schools are very important in the Caribbean because they provide lunches in most countries. Certainly in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, we provide school feeding programs, which capture more than half of the children in St. Vincent and the Grenadines who benefit from that program. But if schools aren't in session, they're no longer able to access those feeding programs. Similarly, churches and NGOs are a very important part of the social protection landscape in ordinary circumstances. But when churches are closed or reduced for various physical distancing reasons, they also lose some of their ability to reach out to vulnerable members of society. So we've tried to shift the provision of food from the schools to entities like our Zero Hunger Trust Fund, and we've tried to provide agricultural produce that we aggregate in central areas and then distribute to churches and NGOs for them to further distribute to vulnerable members of society. The government has also tried to deal with the unemployment challenge by initiating a number of community-level public infrastructure projects, which are the type of large infrastructure projects are slowing down at the moment because of the pandemic, because of the inability of various experts to get in and out of the country. But low-level footpaths and drains and roads and these sorts of things can soak up some of the unemployment that has been created by those displaced in other sectors. And so we've tried to do some work in that regard as well. The challenges that we've faced so far are numerous. And the first challenge, of course, is money. The revenues are declining because of the pandemic. Needs are increasing. And we don't know, as of now, how long the challenges will continue for. So most of the St. Vincent and the Grenadines took a stimulus package and recovery package to Parliament that envisaged a 3-month challenge. So a number of these things that I've been discussing, unemployment support, additional support for the elderly, support for vendors and the like, are conceptualized as 3-month packages. It now seems that the fallout, certainly the social fallout from the pandemic will exceed that 3-month window. And we're going to have to think about where we're going to get additional resources from to continue these stopgap social protection measures going forward. We've realized that the informal sector has been especially hard hit. And there are always challenges, as you know, Magdi, first of all, in defining the informal sector, and secondly, in reaching the informal sector because of the nature of their informality. If you are a vendor and you typically sell snacks to school children, the schools are largely closed. If you depend on a certain amount of foot traffic to do whatever your informal economic activity is in the towns of the country, you too have been affected adversely. But it's always difficult to cast a wide enough net to capture everyone who's in the informal sector. But it is something that is of significance in countries where as much as half of the productive population is involved in some degree of informal activity or the other. the decline in remittances is similarly a challenge, because remittances undoubtedly play an important social protection role in the context of countries like ours. We need more money. I mean, I'm not sure if I can say it any more clearly than that. And you, Magdi, would know very well that all of the countries of the globe agreed to sustainable development goals. And the sustainable development goals, in many ways, are a good social protection roadmap. They talk about activities to do with reducing hunger, reducing inequality, reducing poverty, enhancing health, education, enhancing gender equality, securing decent work and the like. And all of those things are more needed now than ever. But the missing component is goal 17 of the Sustainable Development Goals, which talk about mobilizing resources, which talk about developed countries stepping up development assistance, meeting their pledges, which talk about the respecting policy creativity and the policy space of countries as they try to address these challenges in their own light. And that element of the global cooperation in this fight, and I appreciate that every country is looking inward at the moment because they all have a challenge with the pandemic. But the truth of the matter is the response that is required in Caribbean states, as you indicated, heavily indebted Caribbean states that are facing additional vulnerability from what is expected to be a busier than normal hurricane season. We are not going to be able to meet these demands without the cooperation and the support of our allies, our bilateral allies, and of the international development community. And I know that sometimes there's a focus on items other than social protection, and that the first thing you have to do is get your macroeconomic house in order, and the second thing you have to do is cut the fat in this or that way. But in this particular moment of crisis, not of anyone's making, and as we enter into a season of heightened vulnerability to exogenous shocks, we do have to advocate very strongly to the international community for them to view the social protection challenges that we have now as urgent and as potentially destabilizing, and to see what can be done to assist not only in the planning aspects, in the analysis of the challenges, in the predictive models, but also very importantly in providing resources, because the twin blow of COVID and, God forbid, a busy hurricane season threaten to set the economies of these countries back decades. I know that His Excellency the Premier is still dealing with the aftermath of his own hurricane activity, and thankfully, and probably because of that as well, he moved very proactively to arrest the pandemic in his own context. But none of us in the region can afford COVID plus a hurricane, and we need to discuss the type of international cooperation and support to not only help us through this particular challenge, but to make social protection less of a dirty word in development policy and going forward. I mean, it's very hard to talk about cash transfers, for example, but they're an important aspect of social protection. In our context, we've increased funding to micro enterprises and small businesses because we think that giving money to those entities at this point will help to reduce some of the economic impact from unemployment and other upheaval. And we have to think creatively about the context of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the context of small island states, and our existing economic realities, and what can be done to enhance our ability, our fiscal space and our policy space to address some of these social protection challenges. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. That was, as your usual self, eloquent and brilliant, but also passionate and full of substance. I took notes of several of the things you said. One, a surgically precise description of the linkage of vulnerability between informality, you said, insecurity and inequality. Second, I think you could say it louder but not clearer, that there is a need for development finance. We had the day before yesterday a panel on development finance. That's partly why we wanted to have a conversation between governments, the development partners, and the United Nations to see what can be done, what more can be done. I have to say, in my book, in my experience, I have seen the international financial institutions in the past much less interested in engaging in that conversation. And I'm seeing them today, the senior leadership of these institutions, very, very creative in terms of finding ways to convince their boards and find new alternatives and new possibilities, perhaps less on the debt forgiveness or debt holiday side and more on the increasing of development finance liquidity in the form of new opportunities. The other thing that you said, indeed, we have moved from social safety nets to social protection floors. And one of the reasons is we said, well, try to walk on a net. It's much easier actually to stand tall on a floor. And that metaphor is about the solidity that we want to give to these social protection systems. Our next speaker is one of the most salient development partners, the representative of one of the most salient development partners in the region. Canada has played a role over decades in the leadership of the development partnership. Ambassador Marie Legault is the High Commissioner of Canada in Barbados. In headquarters, Ambassador Legault served as Director of the Central America Division and more recently as the Director of Programming of the Haiti Division. Ms. Legault also served in the Privy Council Office in the Foreign and Defense Policy Secretariat and abroad. She was posted to the High Commission of Canada to Jamaica, serving as the head of their cooperation program. In other words, she knows the region inside out and has a very good experience of what development partnerships look like. Ambassador Legault, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Martinez-Soliman. I want to, first of all, thank you for this invitation for me to represent Canada and participate in this excellent panel, and also to commend you and the UN in general, but UNDP also, for organizing these discussions and sessions, because I think it's extremely important to have these discussions and learn what everybody's doing and to put these issues on the table. And I would like to salute His Excellency Premier Fahy for being here with us, also for your presentation of what's going on in the British Virgin Islands. Thank you for that. And of course, Minister Gonzalez, as you said, so eloquent as usual, so passionate. Thank you for giving us a little bit of an update of what's going on, and not only in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines, but generally in the region. And also it's an honor to be with my colleagues, Director Saeed, as well as Dr. Kamriaji. So I'm not sure there's a lot more for me to say coming after Minister Gonzalez. I think a lot has been said, but perhaps what I can just focus for in my discussion with you, what I can put on the table is perhaps a little bit what's going on in Canada, what's our response both in Canada as well as outside, and especially in the Caribbean, but more globally, because this is a global pandemic, as we know. I don't need to go back on what the situation is. I think the UN Secretary General has put it very clearly in many contexts and many situations, saying that this risks putting over 60 million people more into global extreme poverty. And anyways, I don't need to go back on what the situation is. What struck me hearing both what's the situation in the British Virgin Islands and in San Vicente and the Grenadines, is that we're all in it together. We're facing the same things. What you described was the need for, the impact on all the vulnerable population that we have, be them workers, women, students, parents having to deal with children at home, businesses, of course, farmers. Minister Gonzalez, you talked about the farmers in San Vicente and the Grenadines or in the Caribbean. It's the same in Canada. We also have a big crisis with our farmers. You talked about the informal sector. Canada doesn't have that much of an informal sector, but we do have a lot of small and medium enterprises and a lot of independent workers who are really, really, really vulnerable. And that's I would think probably, I don't have the exact statistics with me, but I would say probably 30% of our economy relies on these independent workers who have very, very little protection. One thing that Premier Fahy talked a little bit about is also about the gender-based violence that is taking place. This is, some experts have quoted saying that this is a shadow pandemic of COVID-19, and this is really true. It has put a little bit to the forefront the issue that the women are very vulnerable in this condition. I don't need to convince you, Magdi, of this, because we're working together on this issue. So what it has put a little bit more to the forefront in Canada, more perhaps than in the Caribbean, is how vulnerable our seniors are. I'm very, very, very happy to see that all over the Caribbean, the response that all the governments have taken have been so swift and efficient. I would say that it has contained very quickly the spread of the pandemic, the number of infected cases, as well as definitely the number of deaths, which in our case, being a bigger country, even though we did take a lot of measures quite early on, for a number of reasons in different provinces, we still have a lot of cases. I've stopped looking at the stats because I think at one point it's just, I don't want to look at the stats anymore, but we have now over 6,000 deaths, and hundreds of thousands of infected people. And as I said, especially on our seniors population and senior homes, which has put a lot of spotlight on the conditions of our health system, especially for seniors. So we're addressing that. Minister Gonzalez, you said that social protection is becoming a dirty word. I'm sorry, it's not a dirty word in Canada at all. This is something that we've always took as extremely important. We are a social state in many ways, and social protection of the vulnerable, we make sure that we leave no one behind. And we will take measures, we are taking measures, but what this crisis has put the spotlight on is something that we are looking at very closely. When this hit, as I said, so I've talked a little bit on the health situation, but let me focus on the more the social aspect, or if you want, the economic aspect of this response that we took. Very early on, from the first days of the crisis, we lost 3 million jobs in Canada. This is huge. So the government, Prime Minister Trudeau, put in place very early on in the first few days a first package, the Canada Emergency Response Benefit Package, which with an envelope of $107 billion. Now, and I'm going to tell you a little bit what it is. Now we're over $600 billion in terms of response to various aspects of our economy and our social components of the economy. And it's, the numbers are bigger, of course, because we are a bigger country, but in terms of what both Premier Fahy said, in terms of the measures that you've taken in the British Virgin Islands, as well as what is going on in the Caribbean and especially in San Vicente and the Grenadines, those measures might be, slightly different, but every government is taking measures to protect its citizens. For us, we've looked, as I said, at seniors, and we will continue to look at that. Students are an important part of the component of what's going on, because they can't find jobs, so they need to have, they can't find time for the summer, so they need to pay for their student loans and so on. So we've put right away a benefit of $2,000 per student for a period of 4 months, that is the summer. For workers, we've put right away a package of $2,000 per month, up to 4 months again, for all the workers, and up to 75% of their salaries, because we knew that if the businesses couldn't pay their salaries, then the businesses would go bankrupt, and of course that has, I don't need to go into the impact of this on the whole economy. For women and children fleeing violence, as we know, as I said, this is a very important aspect of this pandemic, which is perhaps the good thing is that we acknowledge that this is an issue, because very often we don't talk that much about gender-based violence. But so we really early on, we put $50 million into making sure that we increase the shelters all across the country and the response, the call centers, so that women had the possibility of having a place to go and be safe. And an aspect that is different for us in Canada than in the Caribbean is our Indigenous people, which are definitely a very vulnerable segment of our population. And same thing, we've put $305 million of support funds to make sure that especially elders and vulnerable community members were not disproportionately impacted negatively. So that's basically this package is a bit of a mirror of the different packages that have been put in place by various countries around the world to a different extent, as well as in the Caribbean. Let me turn a little bit quickly in terms of what we're doing more globally. Let me start by what we've done and what we're doing in the Caribbean, because this is a very important region for us. And then I'll talk very quickly about what we're doing more globally to address what Minister Gonzalez said, which is the money issue, which is the big aspect of this pandemic, the economic aspect of what this is creating. So very early on, we like a lot of partners, we recognize the need for the health aspect of this crisis, which every government has looked at first, and then looking at the economic aspect of it. So we've, in discussion with Prime Minister Motley, the chair of CARICOM, as well as the Secretary General of CARICOM, we came up with a package of $5 million for health aspects, health PPEs and equipment and so on, that was requested by CARICOM through PAHO, as requested by the chair of CARICOM, in terms of the most efficient way of delivering those goods. We also worked very early on with the Atomic Agency, the Atomic Energy International Agency, because of their capacity as well as their expertise. And same thing, we delivered $5 million of different goods around the region, around the world, where countries needed specific equipment. Specifically also, as you know, Magdi, you referred to the program that we have in the region, and we're working very closely with the UNDP on many of those programs. Of course, we adjusted very quickly those programs, and through one of the programs that we have with you, in collaboration with you, we've adjusted right away to making sure that these programs were addressing the vulnerable population, women and children, as well as vulnerable population, elders, and so on, to making sure that in the countries, in all the countries where we are, it addressed those needs. Looking at one aspect that we haven't talked a lot about is the justice aspect, or the justice systems, that also is an important component of what is going on, making sure that it still is functional and it addresses those vulnerabilities. So that's also an aspect of what we're doing in terms of adjusting the support to the courts, making sure that especially women and children have their hearings as a priority, and working with the various stakeholders as well as police and social workers and so on. I don't want to go into a lot of details, because this is of course we are responding in many ways. We've talked about Minister Gonzalez, and well, everybody is talking about the Premier Faye also, about the threat of the hurricane season that is upon us. We've just started 4 days ago, and it's supposed to be a higher than usual season this year. So we're very, very much aware of that. So we're working with already preparing with a number of our partners, Lima, to adjust a little bit the response and how we can work in preparing both the COVID pandemic as well as the hurricane season coming upon us, and with other partners like the Red Cross and others. So that gives you a little bit of an idea what we're doing both in Canada as well as specifically in the Caribbean. Of course, and we have with us Director Sahid, what is going on with the various international financial institutions is definitely a discussion that we're having both at the IMF and the World Bank and other, of course, multilateral banks around the world in terms of looking at our systems, our processes as part of those banks to see, are they still adequate? Is this the response that we need to have, you know, as a member of those banks? Let me conclude by mentioning something very important and going to what Minister Gonzalez said about the money issue. We're all very aware that the money issue, Premier Fahy also mentioned the need for liquidities. Everybody mentions that. It is the big issue for every country around the world, especially vulnerable countries. Last week, and I'm sure a lot of you know about the high-level discussion on financing for development in times of COVID-19 that took place, where Canada, co-hosted with Jamaica, this discussion with the UN Secretary General. It was a very successful discussion, and this discussion was to look at think outside of the box. That's how Prime Minister Trudeau put it. We need to look outside of the box, think differently about these issues and what we can do, and find pragmatic solutions. So this discussion joined over 50 leaders from around the world, and looked at pragmatic solutions. Prime Minister Trudeau alluded to a global response package that we would need to put in place, as well as a comprehensive debt framework, which is exactly what Minister Gonzalez was talking about. A lot of members of the Caribbean were there. This was global. This was with leaders from all over the planet, including a number from the Caribbean. Of course, it was co-hosted with Prime Minister Holness from Jamaica, but also Prime Minister Motley was there, Prime Minister Chastanet. And they all talked about, Prime Minister Motley put on the table the need for a global leadership initiative, and also ensuring that we put natural disaster clauses as the hurricanes in what we're doing in the instruments that we're putting together. So it was a very, very rich discussion, but more importantly, it concluded by the fact that we need to have, of course, what are the next steps that we need to have right now. And it put together 6 working groups. I'm not going to name all the groups, but main ones that pertinent to this discussion and what both speakers before me said was one on expanding liquidities. We need to look at expanding liquidities for all countries, especially vulnerable countries. The debt vulnerability, which is something that the Caribbean has been put forward for years and years about the need to revise the debt vulnerability. The need to expand external finance for growth and job creation, which is definitely a solution to this liquidity crisis, and of course looking at climate change issues and so on, as we still need to do definitely. And these working groups will come up with concrete proposals by mid-July. So this is not just a discussion and then we close and we go. This is very much something concrete to look at solutions for this current crisis right now. And just in conclusion, I think that, you know, we know all the challenges that this crisis is putting us into every country and the citizens of every country. One thing though that there's always very often I tend to look at the glass half full. And in this case, maybe it's not half full, it's a little bit full, maybe not half full, but there's always indirect benefits. And I think that this crisis has led leaders of the world to really talk together to find concrete solutions on flows of goods that we needed in every country, flow in terms of the food crisis, making sure that there is no food crisis around the world, making sure that we still keep borders open for essential goods and so on. So it usually once a year everybody gathers together in September at the UN. But in this case, these conversations are taking place all over the place. I know for sure that Prime Minister Trudeau, as well as all cabinet ministers, are talking to their counterparts, if not sometimes on a daily basis, but definitely on a weekly basis, to address those challenges and work together to find a solution and not working in isolation. So anyways, that's maybe a indirect benefit, and I think these conversations will continue after to helping find concrete solutions. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Legault. And one of your mentions, you thanked us. I return the gratitude for having convened these talks, these conversations, or these consultations. If anything, what we wanted it to be is an advocacy effort for an extraordinary injection of development finance that is really needed. And we know that those who are speaking on the panels, everybody who works in the Caribbean or for the Caribbean, is already convinced. We need to convince others, but we thought that it would be a good way of sharing the best arguments that we have in our arsenal, so that we can then redeploy with the complete suite of ideas and of reasons why this is now more needed than ever. I also wanted to pick up on something. You are the third speaker of three who highlights the importance and the placing at the center of the support actions are senior citizens, our elderly. This has not been something frequent. It has not been in the development discourse. It has not been in the social protection discourse to take care of our elders. That is something relatively new, and that has come to the fore because this vicious and lethal virus is particularly tough and dangerous for our older folks. The last thing I want to say is that every time I hear you, and I don't know if ladies and gentlemen who are listening to us on UWE Live or will agree with me, but every time I listen to you, Ambassador, I hear in the background the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's always there. You do it in a non-strident way. You do it in a very persuasive way, which is even better and more effective in my book. But it's always very principled, and I think we need those principles always on the table. Precisely because we wanted to have a conversation around social protection, but also the need to finance it. And I don't want to put Director Tahseen Sayed in any hot seat, but obviously the financial institutions have a big responsibility in terms of providing some of the responses that the government are requesting. Director Sayed is the World Bank's lead person for the Caribbean countries and Latin American. Ms. Sayed, a Pakistani national, has served in management positions in Europe and the Central Asia region and the South Asia region of the World Bank. Mr. Tahseen Sayed is a seasoned development professional with over 20 years of operational and leadership experience at the bank, and she is today with us to deliver some remarks. Tahseen, you do have the floor.
Thank you very much, Magdi, and good, is it afternoon? Yes, good afternoon to the panel members, especially Honorable Prime Minister BVI. I had the pleasure of meeting you in BVI. I don't know if you recall, during the Clinton Foundation event. And of course, it's a delight to be here with friends from the Caribbean, Finance Minister St. Vincent Grenadines, and Ambassador, of course, and a colleague from the UNICEF who will come after me. Some really, I think, remarkable inputs have come in at this point, and it's always challenging to come a bit late in the panel to add value. I will come to the point, Magdi, that you mentioned on the responsibility of the international financial institutions. But let me perhaps say at the outset how valuable these interactions are. Just for the purpose of those connected through University of West Indies to this event, that all of us are collectively benefiting from such engagements simply because the way we are sitting right now for us in the United States, where I'm based right now with the World Bank, we are still in lockdown in Washington, DC. So these opportunities are really great opportunities for coming together, because the key lesson of every crisis has been that the response works much more effectively, faster, and goes to the right individuals and needs when the players work together. And the players working together, I mean from the communities to the international institutions, to the public sector governments, to the NGOs, to the civil society and development agencies, but very, very important, and I hope we have some of those connected here, the youth, the young people. So in that context, thank you very much, Magdi, for organizing this. This particular crisis, I mean, for the Caribbean, a crisis is not unknown at all. Every year there is this planning and preparation going on for the hurricane seasons. But globally, I would like to mention that there are three, I feel the three areas where this crisis is perhaps maybe never again, I hope, will happen in our lifetime, but there are three dimensions. One is that it is universal in nature. And my friend and colleague, the finance minister mentioned, it's continuing. We don't know when the end will come. So that's a very critical thing to keep in mind. The second is this is a global crisis, universal in nature. Only a few handful of countries are not affected, some in the Pacific Islands. That this is the first time that something like this has happened in the digital age. And I mentioned that because the digital age has enabled us to be connected like this, but it also provides opportunities to benefit more from technology. And the third part is, people like myself or my generation, when we were growing up, we would always hear from our elders, from everyone, that the biggest equalizer in the world is education. Today, I'm seeing that this crisis has been a biggest equalizer. It has not seen a developed world or a developing world or a brown face or a black face or a white face. It has, or a male or a female, it cuts across, or rich or poor. So I mentioned this because this, I mean, what my friend, the ambassador mentioned from Canada, when you were sharing your economic and social stimulus packages, same in the United States, same that the Honorable Prime Minister shared, same that you shared, Finance Minister. So every country is impacted and is trying to address. So it's really cuts, it's in a way the biggest equalizer for the entire universe, so to speak. For the Caribbean, of course, the uniqueness is the overlay of the natural disaster that will be there, and for many other parts of the world as well. Having said that, let me touch upon a few of the, because we talk a lot about the Caribbean data and the information, but it's good to place the Caribbean in the global context. As we speak today, our new, from the World Bank side, our new Global Economic Prospect Report will be out, I think, in the next 3-4 days. But the main data that's coming out from it for 2020 is that there will be a 5% drop in global GDP, and that is huge. Secondly, we all know that the job loss is tremendous. I think the finance minister mentioned the informal sector. 1.6 billion people are employed in the informal sector in the world today, out of which over 740 million are women. And women are, we know, disproportionately impacted by anything that happens in the world. The impact on the poor and the women is more stark. So that's the kind of data we are looking at. In terms of remittances, the drop in 2020 will be 1/5 for the countries. In the Caribbean itself, for the Eastern Caribbean countries, it ranges from the remittances as a share of GDP for the Eastern Caribbean range from 2.5% of GDP to 5.5% of GDP, which is, I think, is your number, the 5.5% in St. Vincent and Grenadines, Finance Minister. So we can assume that this is for the 6 months of this calendar year, this will not be coming in because the jobs are not there where the remittances were coming from. Tourism, on an average for the Eastern Caribbean, the share of tourism in employment is about 30 to 40%. So you can imagine the impacts coming there. You already mentioned, Ambassador, the 60 million estimate of population that could fall into the poverty line. I'm sharing this, I know many of you already may be aware of this data or this information. What I'm trying to, I think, convey through it is the globalness of the, not globalness is not a word, the global nature of the impacts and across the board, and hence the bigger need to come together as all partners to address these challenges, especially for the more vulnerable population and the more vulnerable countries. Let me mention very briefly on, because I wanted to touch upon what the World Bank has been trying to do, but also the social protection dimension of it. And I agree with you, Ambassador, that social protection is actually the critical part of the not only the immediate emergency health response, but also the recovery response. In that context, from the World Bank side, from April, in a 2-month period, the World Bank was able to commit to over 100 countries a financing envelope of $5.5 billion in 2 months, in April and May, when the crisis started. This through new financing, through reorienting existing financing towards the emergency and then replenishing the country's resources. And out of those 100 countries, I'm very, very proud to say that 10 countries are in the Caribbean. Not just the Eastern Caribbean, such as, Dominican Republic, which is not part of Eastern Caribbean, is included in that. Haiti is included in that. So, 10% of the 100 countries are in the Caribbean who have received the support of up to $200 million. This is, a bulk of it is, of course, Dominican Republic, but it's also $30 million for the Eastern Caribbean and small islands so far. As we speak now, the focus from the World Bank side and the approach to the first phase was really saving lives, which is the health system, the health support. But we are very quickly moving towards, and the minister knows that because we've been engaging with the island on that front and his other colleagues too. We are moving towards a consolidated approach of saving lives, protecting the poor and the vulnerable, second part. The third part is trying to support countries in their businesses and job creation, because that's a key thing, given the drop in tourism. And we do know that while tourism will pick up in the coming period, the impact this year is huge. And fourthly, on trying to work in rebuilding better with the institution and policies that are required. So those will be the 4 sort of critical elements of our engagement going forward. And the World Bank group has given itself a target. The self-target is that in the next 15 months, we will bring in $160 billion more financing in the next 15 months. And that's a very big number. And that's the commitment, that is self-commitment to the World Bank, that we want to move on. And fast track work is happening. And for the Caribbean, similarly, in all the Caribbean islands where we have active engagement through concessional financing, which we call International Development Association window, and where we have a regular financing, we are fast tracking our support across the various dimensions, including liquidity support that you mentioned, financing this day. So that's a bit on the World Bank side. I want to then touch upon the social protection. Can you, Jawara, put in the first two tables I had, the first one and the second one? I just wanted to, yes. So here you see that you already, the Caribbean has been pretty well advanced. If we break down the social protection dimension into three areas, the social assistance or social safety nets and the labor markets, and the social insurance side, you see the various countries where you have the tick, they have some, many have many more, some have all, but essentially there's quite a robust various elements there already in the SP programs. There are weaknesses, and I'll touch upon that in a bit later. Can you put the second slide on, please, Jawara? Yes. So this is very important. This shows to you, and this is based on from the World Bank side, we are doing a very real-time assessment of country measures across the entire country. I don't mean across the entire country, I meant across the entire world. And there are 190 countries globally that have, I'm showing you only the sort of from the critical Caribbean countries, the table, but we have a similar thing for 190 countries that have either planned, introduced, or adapted social protection measures in response to COVID-19. And to share one data set with you, on 20th of March 2020, 45 countries had adopted 103 measures connected in some way to the social protection family. 22nd of May, which is just a few weeks from a couple of weeks in the past, 937 measures had been adopted by 190 countries. So, that's a very good news that countries are galloping to bring in the social protection measures. And I think the point that you raised, Minister, is very critical. You plan for 3 months. Many of these measures that you are seeing in green ticks are planned by countries. Our average is 3 months. It's 1 to 6 months, but the average is 6 months. So important to keep in mind that this 3 months may need to be extended because we don't know the extent to which the crisis will last, and taper down, and the extent to which the economy will rebound, especially for the tourism-dependent economies in this table that you're seeing. And out of these measures that you're looking at, the cash measures are 50% in terms of the dollar, and rightly so. And that's an area where the World Bank is extremely supportive as well. In fact, in several countries, we are trying to such as in Dominica, in Belize, where the countries are trying to move towards more cash transfers. We are working with them, using their existing systems to help them add new beneficiaries who have lost jobs and who are suffering. And that goes for all Eastern Caribbean countries too, because there are your existing beneficiaries, but then you have the ones who are suffering now. In terms of the social insurance side, that's about 27% of the measures are linked to that. So I just thought it would be interesting to get for the audience here to get a sense that what you are doing in the Caribbean or the Eastern Caribbean is a universal phenomena everywhere. The final point I wanted to touch upon was the third slide, please, Jawara. And this is just to bring us all on these social protection delivery mechanisms and what is it that is critical to look at today and going forward. Of course, I fully understand, and my colleagues in the World Bank fully understand at all levels, at higher management level, senior management, plus technical experts that now is not the time to be discussing systemic, institutional, deep-rooted reforms. Yes, we have been working on that with many countries, but now is the time to build upon what is there in the country to help the countries weather the storm, and to then do on a medium-term reform trajectory and medium-term institutional improvements that are very much needed. So in that context, I wanted to share a few areas linked to the social protection delivery systems. As you saw in the previous slide, they're in all countries. But what are the areas where some improvements are needed? The Caribbean countries do not have a national unique ID system. And that is extremely helpful in normal times. Normal times for citizenry's engagement with the state, be it to get a driver's license, a passport, or to get social assistance for the vulnerable. And that's an area where I am really hopeful. There's a new project that the World Bank is going to be financing, which is going to our board of directors for approval in the next 2 weeks. It covers initially 4 countries in the Eastern Caribbean. And we hope that part of it would also help in moving forward in this area. The second part, which is again extremely important, is the paucity of reliable and current data on poverty and unemployment. And that has been one of the issues that I personally, not as a World Bank person, but as a professional person, feel that it is absolutely the accountability of all the partners who work globally and also in the Caribbean with the country governments that we need to help the countries in this front. And we are actually moving forward with, again, trying to work directly with the statistical bodies to begin this process. Of course, the surveys cannot be done right now, but that is an important part going forward. The third part is that there are many flagship safety net programs in many of the countries that you saw in the previous slide. The coverage is an issue in that. Either the coverage has to be revised, or people who are out of the net, who are not in it. One of your questions, Magdi, was who is not in it and should be there. This is where it's critical to look at. And the next part I wanted to mention is, which is very much connected to jobs. Because at the end of the day, it is all about income, and it is all about income growth. And the active labor market programs and how they respond to the private sector needs is very much a social protection related aspect, because as I mentioned, that the 3 aspects of social protection: social assistance, social insurance, and the labor markets. And finally, an area which is which I mentioned earlier on, of the uniqueness of this crisis, is the happening in this digital world. And I do feel and believe very, very strongly, I cannot say it more strongly, that the Caribbean has to assume, the Caribbean leadership has to assume, the Caribbean private sector has to assume, the Caribbean youth has to assume, and all of us together, a more leadership role on digital and embracing the digital agenda, and not be a laggard in this, but the leader in this. And I connect it only to one dimension right now. The first, the unique ID system, and the last one, the payment systems. If I am, you mentioned the elderly, if I am a 85 or 90-year-old woman, even if my island is small, say St. Vincent Grenadines, or it is Dominica, or is it Grenada, even if the size of my island in mileage terms is small, it's some miles for me as an 85-year-old woman to move to get my benefit, my payment benefit. Why can't I get it through the click of a phone, e-payment system, or use technology? So that's where I think is the key. And again, I hope that one input that from the World Bank group that we can make is through this digital engagement, which is already which is called the Digital Transformation Project. It's about over $90 million, I think, for 4 countries and regional agencies. So it's a big injection. It is required because digital infrastructure is also very expensive. So I think I want to end on a positive note that when we look at all the countries in the world and what has happened as a consequence of COVID to many of the developed countries in Europe and in this country where I'm sitting, and also now happening in South America, really rising, the Caribbean has been incredibly strategic. Countries did the lockdown before when they had 1 or 2 or 5 or 6 or even 3 cases. In one case, there was no case. That preemptive lockdown and very strict measures, I think, have been, I feel, I'm not a doctor, but I feel extremely helpful in the containment of the virus, not just in the country that we have BVI or in St. Vincent Grenadines, but across the entire Caribbean. Of course, Dominican Republic has a larger share right now, but in the small islands, I think the good news is that you are here, not the laggard, but the leaders in containment of COVID-19 right now. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Director Sayed. That was quite a powerful statement as well. And we take note both of the data that are daunting, but also of the note of optimism and strategic direction for the future. For sure, going digital is going to be part of the response in the education sector, as well as for small and medium enterprises going online, reinventing their services and so forth. I also wanted to add that, in my opinion, the governance of the crisis has been exemplar in the Caribbean, and the leadership deserves praise in terms of participation, respect, public information, accountability to Parliament and other watchdogs. It's really been spectacular. We just have to turn on the TV to see numerous places where it hasn't been. So I rest my case on that. I have good news. Our friends from UE Television are allowing us another 15 minutes, which will take a little bit of pressure off the shoulders of my colleague and friend Alois Kamuraguiye, who will be our last speaker today. Dr. Kamuraguiye is the UNICEF representative for the Eastern Caribbean. He's a national of Burundi who has served as UNICEF representative to Djibouti and Morocco, and most recently as the UNICEF Congo office in Brazzaville rep. Before joining UNICEF, he held several positions as a senior manager in the health sector in his home country, Burundi, and at Montreal University, as well as in WHO. Alois, you do have the floor.
So, thank you, Magdi. I join the previous presenters to thank you for your leadership and for facilitating this great conversation. Tuesday, it was about development financing. Now we are talking about social protection. These are things that are really at the heart of UN work, not only in the Caribbean, but also in other regions. So in the interest of time, I understand, of course, the pressure. I think I'm gonna use just the few slides, 6 slides, just to share my key messages. I'm sharing. I wonder whether you can see the slide. Okay, so quickly, I'm gonna just recall for those who are listening to us, the social protection system, the status of social protection in the Eastern Caribbean, because UNICEF, we have been working with the different countries since a couple of years. We have some analysis about the situation, the impact of COVID-19 on social protection, especially on children, the data we have. national social protection response to COVID-19. I will not elaborate because the previous presenters spoke to that extensively. Of course, I think it's interest for countries to know what they can get from UN in terms of support, especially technical support, to accelerate progress with regard to social protection. And of course, I'm going to close with a few recommendations. Yeah, this gives, this is a snapshot on how at UNICEF really we did the status of social protection in the Eastern Caribbean. You can see on this line some elements, criteria, which constitute the defined characteristic of the social protection system in a country. And you can see that, first of all, policy. Is there a policy on social protection? Second, legislation. Here we just looked at Social Assistance Act. Operational and targeting tools, the digitization of social register. So you can see that we have, the good news is that we have some greens. For instance, for policy, in most of the countries, there is a social protection policy, apart from Barbados. For legislation, however, we see that we see 3 countries that have not yet developed legislation around social protection. The tools in general, they are across the Eastern Caribbean, the tools are there. Digitization of social registry, and here again, that's an area that requires some progress. I wonder whether you can see the last column, because the last column is about the coverage. You can see here the last column is about the coverage, and and it's clear that across the Eastern Caribbean the coverage is very low. So it means that the majority of vulnerable population in the Caribbean doesn't benefit from the assistance from the government to prevent or protect against poverty, vulnerability, or social exclusion. Here, this slide shows the impact of COVID-19 on, especially on children. You can see for the Caribbean, overall for Latin America and the Caribbean, we have had COVID-19 has increased of 22%. The child poverty. And for the Caribbean, we talk about an increase of 19%. And this means more vulnerable people that need social protection assistance. I will not speak to this because my predecessors elaborated on what countries are doing to strengthen the social protection response. I'm gonna more comment on this slide on UN support to protection system. And I assess the UN work against this conceptual framework on social protection system developed by UNICEF that has at its center, at its heart, the programs. The programs are known: social transfers, social insurance, labor and jobs, social service workforce. And of course, those programs are underpinned by policies which are informed by evidence based. The World Bank country director has talked about the need to invest in data generation. That's critical because without having sound data, the countries cannot come up with relevant policies. And the other pillar is the admin one, which speaks to tools such as registries, payment mechanism, grievance and redress. The World Bank country director spoke to that. And of course, all the system needs to be shock responsive. It means that the social protection system in each country has to be designed in a way that it responded to an emergency, to a crisis. So the UN agencies across the Eastern Caribbean can provide, they can provide technical assistance to countries in all the 4 pillars. I cannot afford not to speak to the UN Joint SDG Fund Program, Universal Adaptive Social Protection. The premier from BVI alluded to that. This program seeks to enhance resilience and accelerate SDG in the Eastern Caribbean. It's implemented in Barbados, St. Lucia, and by the OECS Commission. It's a $5 million US program. And also you are aware about the COVID-19 multi-sector response plan that the UN Barbados OECS launched a few weeks ago for $30 million US, of which social protection represents 12 million. So this is my last slide on recommendations. First of all, we recommend to integrate, to scale up social protection program in existing social protection system instead of creating a new program. Coordinate the overall response with social security to create a comprehensive framework of assistance. 3, expand social assistance and social security to be more inclusive where possible. 4, that speaks to financing. Leverage financing opportunities of domestic and external sources to support social protection needs. And lastly, invest in opportunities to strengthen systems in times of crisis. I think that the World Bank country director spoke to that. I think this is, at the time we respond to the emergent needs, at the same time, we have to do it in a way that strengthens the social protection system, that speaks to policy, the delivery mechanism, the data management. That's it.
Dr. Kamuragi, I owe you an apology, which will turn itself into a lunch invitation as soon as restaurants are up and running. Sorry for rushing you into the last minutes, and thank you very much for making it extremely short. I have 3 minutes left from our television program and wanted to ask the Honorable Premier and the Minister of Finance to address them if they could. Premier, there is a question about, which you alluded to. You spoke about creating a social security scheme. So many persons in the informal economy, asks one of our viewers, were not contributors to the social security and have remained unprotected. What could be done to, in the future, include also informal workers in any social security scheme. Could you speak to that?
Well, first of all, you have to do an assessment to know how many of them that would exist in any area. But going forward, what we have to do is to help people with more knowledge of when they do get the jobs, to be able to contribute towards the social security or whatever other social schemes that they may have, so that when these times come, they will be able to benefit from them. So before I go into the substantive one of that, for example, one of we want to do the unemployment fund in case of catastrophic events or a pandemic along this line. So we're in the middle of getting that legislation done for the Social Security Board, which has been on the table for quite some time. So we're trying to get it off now. Being on the government for the last 15 months, we decided to move it forward. But right now, our Social Security scheme is 8.5% in terms of the regular scheme. And one of our elected officials that's on the government side, one named Honorable Neville Smith, came up with the idea. Rather than going and adding a new percentage to that, let's take off a percentage from the 8.5 who creating any more burden on businesses, and just put a 1% and leave it at 7.5%, and then let that scheme start to build up itself. So it's to contribute towards schemes like our fishermen. We have fishermen that didn't put into the scheme at all, but they've been fishing over the years. So a lot of informal things have happened in our countries over the years because it was just the way of life. So we want to custom up these kind of hurricanes. We want to custom. We never had them. We never had the pandemics. These health issues. So we didn't have to worry about them, and they were able to sustain themselves right up until they leave the earth. But now these are coming on to us too fast, and when they come very furious. So now we have to look at our social assessment and how do we go about programs for those persons, but also start to educate the upcoming generation to make sure that they avoid falling into that area. One of the things that I see right now as I look at America is, and I was talking about constitutional review in our territory, and I was saying one of the areas that they left out is that they talk about equal rights and justice, but the equal rights was not equal. So we have to make sure that we come up with systems that are equal, so that everyone can have the same equal rights. But that's the next generation coming. Those that are there, we have to look to see what funding we can get from the programs that are already going well. Because some persons always say, don't touch Social Security because we need it when we retire. But if we're not alive to get it when we retire, then we can't get it. So we have to realize that those kind of funds, we have to find how to invest them now so that we can help our people that are falling through the net as we speak, to make sure that we help them get a hand up and then help with our economies. Easier said than done, but we have to keep helping our economy so that when they do get the jobs, that they start to pay into the scheme so that they can be removed from that category into the category where they could be self-sustained. But in case they cannot, then they're contributing to the system and it allows it to happen. So it's an education process of bringing our people along. But for right now, governments are saddled all over the world to make sure that they find monies to help those individuals. And it's always a challenge because sometimes some technical persons who gets their check every 15th or 30th of the month or every month sometimes don't understand, some of them don't understand the challenges of persons who have to generate their own income or who have no income at all but are trying to get a job. And you also have to find a way to deal with them. And I always tell persons that you cannot leave out anyone, because the young man that you ignore, although you might be affluent or seem affluent, that young man might end up to be your son-in-law. And the young lady that you ignore might end up to be your daughter-in-law. So we have to make sure that we get involved in all these areas and help everyone along.
Thank you so much, Excellency. The last question is going to be for the Finance Minister. It came from UWTV Network, from uwtv.org. And the viewer asks, what role can the diaspora play in the socioeconomic and technical response? Is there any way people who are not in St. Vincent and the Grenadines could help you respond to the crisis apart from sending remittances to their family? Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. And it's always good to see resources in times of difficulty. The Vincent and the Vincentian diaspora, that is citizens of St. Vincent and the Grenadines who live outside of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, comprise a larger population of Vincentians than those who live on island. There are more Vincentians outside of the country than there are in the country. And so obviously that is a tremendous wellspring of experience, of talent, of ability, and of perspective that we've all been trying to harness in one way or the other. And unfortunately, harnessing the diaspora to date has been very much like harnessing the informal sector. We know they're out there, but they're very difficult it's very difficult to quantify in a way. The government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and indeed all of the governments of the region, I believe, have been engaged in one level or the other of outreach towards their diaspora communities, beyond that remittance link that happens not really between state and diaspora, but between and among family members. And we have been trying, first of all, to incentivize the diaspora using their resources to start businesses, to become employers here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, to make voluntary contributions to the social security networks in our respective countries, to make those social protection apparatuses more fluid and more liquid, and also to help them on retirement. And very importantly, to try to benefit from the wide range of experiences and perspectives that exist in our diaspora communities. I think that in a time of need, which is what we're clearly in now, it's a spirit of all hands on deck, and we need those who are either have the financial means or have perspectives or experience to bring those experiences to bear. Obviously, it's not a situation where people can come home at the moment, but there's a tremendous amount of outreach that's going on between governments and our state agencies, consulates, and so on overseas, to try to harness that type of experience beyond the remittance setting. The short answer is we need you. And we need you in a number of multifaceted ways. And I think that our consulates and our ministries of foreign affairs, which deal with our diaspora, have a number of programs in place, depending on your skill set and the perspectives that you would have to bear.
Thank you very much, Minister. Thank you, Honorable Premier, Director Sayed, my good friend Alois, Ambassador Legault. Thank you all for participating in this roundtable. I'd like to close just with one remark. Minister Camillo said none of us can afford COVID and a hurricane, and I think he's right. We can't avoid it either, but we can prepare and respond together. And I think that was the spirit of this consultation and of this conversation. Thank you very much. Thank you to UWE-TV, and thank you to all who contributed today with their thought leadership and with their generosity. Have a nice afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, UNDP.
Thank you, World Bank. Thank you, Canada. Thank you, BVI. And thank you.